Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the main stage here at FTT Digital Builder. And we're about to embark on the next section of our agenda where we get to talk about toolkits and open APIs and all those things that you digital builders need to build the modern world. So to start off our section, we are going to sit down with a fireside chat with Elliot Lim, Chief Customer Officer at Mambu. Hello, Elliot. How are you?
Very good, Liz. Thank you for having me. It's great to be
Excellent.
here. And for me, this is really exciting as well because it's the first time I've been asked about technology for about 5 years. It's sitting on the commercial side of the business. I get a lot of commercial conversations, but my background is tech. I degree in computer science, master's software engineering, and spent most of my career in the tech side of banks. So this is nice to come back to my roots. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. I'm really glad that we'll have a good conversation. So we're going to start off this with kind of a general question. I mean, there's a lot of talk over the past 2 years about the age of digitalization, and everyone talks about open APIs and different toolkits that are kind of needed to build the modern financial services that a lot of people in the ecosystem are doing. And I don't really want to get into, I mean, maybe bad builders sort of blame their tools, but I wanted to get your view on what you think of the quality of the tools and APIs out there right at the moment. Are they fit for purpose? Is there enough quality out there for digital builders to do what they need to do right now?
Good question. I mean, the old adage, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think we have been besieged by bad tooling for many generations of banking, and I think it's partially because we've not looked for it, because we've always followed the old ways of thinking. I think the tooling is out there now. I think it's got a lot better. I think there's a lot more integration. There are built API networks to allow more collaboration, to really build something agile. I'll probably repeat myself several times during this, but I don't think technology is the be-all, end-all, the toolkits or the end implementation. It's a mindset you need to have and a mind shift to have the right tooling. It's something that actually now is a lot more open, available, and I think, the tooling's there, but it's just how people are using the tooling. There's still a bit of a learning curve to happen.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, later on during the day, we're going to talk a bit about culture and communication. But as you said, very enjoyably, we're talking about the tools right at the moment and the technology. I see a bit, on Twitter and LinkedIn, kind of a debate about what we mean by digitalization. And I think there are, lots of examples where you see sort of a digital front end, but the back end is still sort of the old world legacy tech, not a front to back digital experience. Are you seeing a lot of examples of products that fit that characteristic, digital to the outside world, but not very digital in the back end?
Yeah, I think it's an old way of working that's still around, right? I remember back when we had green screens, we screen scraped and put them onto color screens, and it was seen as great technology. There's nothing really different when you take a legacy back end and put a digital front end. It's actually not a lot different to that old way of working. You're going to have some of the benefits. You're going to have a better customer experience, arguably, but you still have a lot of those problems in the backside where, and I think that's actually a very good point for us. You're asking about the tooling availability and sort of saying about how we use the tooling is important. It's how you actually look at the back end, because a lot of that value is not just the customer experience. It really is in how we actually process things, how we link together, how quickly can you launch a new product, how quickly can you work around technology limitations, business limitations. So I think it's one of my pet hates, and I've had this for a long time, where something looks cool and is very good, but unfortunately it ends up adding more complexity because you put an extra integration layer, or you have to change and abstract and aggregate data, and that's never the right thing to do for the customer or the business, in my view.
No, I agree. I think sometimes the best advice with technology is to use the simplest option possible instead of the most exciting new thing possible. I mean, maybe you can go into
simplicity. Absolutely.
Agree. I mean, maybe you can go into a bit more detail about some of the other barriers that you see that stop that full digital end-to-end process from happening for a lot of organizations. What are some of the barriers you're seeing?
Yeah, I as you say, we're not here to talk about the culture and everything in this session, but I do think it's hard to ignore that. There is a great win when you have a co-culture, something collaborative where people can think across different organizations. When you're looking to take out the core banking system or your payment system, your cash management, or anything that's in the core, it's the equivalent of open heart surgery for a bank. So it's very difficult to sort of move into that way of thinking that, hey, we can do something that's agile, that's a different way of working. And it's a move from having a perceived technology risk to having a very real business risk. So if you sort of see this, the way of working, we've always built large scale transformations that can take 3-5 years. And we've had technology roadmaps that have allowed us to implement over those times and those life cycles. That's not really the way that things are working now. Not just because of COVID expediting it, but it's been a long time where we've been moving away from the legacy way of working, legacy way of thinking, not just customers demanding more, but actually business models, revenue models demanding that we have this technology, put it in place, and we drive something. So I think a lot of it is about that organizational behavior, not just in the technology side, but in the business side. And I think, a big shift in that is that nowadays, especially if you look at some neobanks, they started a bit of a trend where the technology guys were the business guys. That's now pervaded further into your classic banks, your tier ones, your tier twos. And I think as you put technology at the core of it, this tooling becomes a lot more around not just developer tools, but actually they become the business tools that are the developer tools, because you actually have a lot of developers in new guises, in new roles, in senior roles, making those decisions. And it's a different way of thinking, and it's a different mentality. And I think that mentality gets you to a point where you can use the tooling to its best effect.
No, I agree. I think we are seeing a lot more people with a tech background moving into the business side of organizations, which is making a difference. But in terms of sort of a like practical advice, when you go out there to evaluate some of the tools that you need, what are some of the right questions and criteria that need to be asked before you do that?
I think there's a lot of the standards around usability, scalability, a lot of the tech things that come with it, also referenceability, where are you seeing this tool being used, how is it being used? Because especially when you're talking about platforms, API type technology, you actually want an ecosystem, and you want to be part of it. You want to see something that actually adds value, and that's fundamentally important. For me, I think once you get through the basis of asking all the questions, it's the same as when people sort of look for a SaaS solution. And I think it's the same sort of modeling. People can say, hey, my SaaS is better than your SaaS, or we have better cloud provisions, or whatever it may be. We've been playing this game for generations. It's not an EAI, it's an ESB. We can look at different ways of looking at how APIs evolved, how we grow. It's a real fundamental for me that actually you look about what is the value you're going to add by using that tooling. Can it be is it obviously going to increase your agility, reduce costs, reduce risks? But what is the fundamental benefit it gives to you, your business, your customers? And so I would sort of think outside the box, because anybody who's providing tooling, and any of the vendors out there providing tooling, they will be used to answering here is the TPS, here are the MIPS that it takes to get a return, here are the standard deviations of all the different variances we can get. Think about actually what is that in business value. And I know this is about tooling, but I think there is a real fundamental here in making sure people can think that hybrid. And I think the most successful organizations, the most successful people in the industry now, as we've said, are that sort of hybrid of a tech expert, a banking expert that comes together to really drive this. So see that tooling as something that's fundamental and gives a better service to your customers, increases revenue and everything else, not just the one that has the coolest UX.
I liked what you said in the beginning. My cloud is better than your cloud, and there's lots of sort of platform providers out there. I mean, maybe this is sort of the next moving on of the question. How do you evaluate those partners? What questions do you need to ask?
I think there's around industry adoption. There's around making sure that there is a position and a value in everything that's taking place. You want all the basics, right? You want, especially for an API or a platform, you want a good developer portal. You want to have good API documentation. You want a clear UX, UI. You want to see evidence of good regression testing, and to make sure that they're going to be there for the long haul. If you're building in, there's a lot of people saw the risk of moving from sort of closed APIs into open APIs as a way of sort of looking at, hey, well, not invented here syndrome. How do we drive things differently? But I would look for a community. How do we drive innovation as not just an organization, but how do we drive it actually as a market, as an industry, to show that we can do that? And I think when you've got those right innovation hubs, which I think is what an API or a platform really is opening up to, that has the different segmentation, the collective collaborative input, I suppose, for want of a better term, that allows people to drive forward to something different. It comes to much more the basics of saying, hey, you're not going to find, I don't think, anybody that's scalable in the market that doesn't say, hey, we have referenceability, open API architecture, good, strong documentation, referenceability, everything else that goes with it. There needs to be something that actually, I think, builds those ecosystems, because those ecosystems is really where the value comes when you start working with the API technology.
Interesting. I mean, I guess this sort of leads me to my next question. You mentioned this sort of the industry moving from, using closed APIs to open APIs. What's kind of the difference? How do you choose between the two?
I think you can see where the reason for using the closed, if you're doing IP protection or there is some sort of security piece that you want to keep in-house, you don't want to share, then that is obviously a valid reason. I think the answer lies in a hybrid model between the two. There are usually some things you want to protect, but I think when you go closed, you are removing a lot of innovation opportunity. You're moving a lot of potential reuse of other people's IP, potential co-innovation, collaboration across the board. So I think I would always look into actually what is it that's going to bring, again, that value to the end customer, the business value, balancing what I mentioned earlier between that tech risk versus business risk, because been in this industry for 25 years in various guises, in banks, in consultancies, in fintechs, and I've worked for some of the world's largest banks, and every bank sort of brainwashes you into thinking that they do things different to everybody else. I actually would challenge that in pretty much every bank that I've worked in or worked for. They're not that different. They may be the 1-2%, and I think that's where the differentiation for the closed APIs can come into play. But honestly, if you map that entire architecture from everything you're trying to achieve and everything you may want to achieve, the solution's already out there. Why do you need to build it yourself when you can go out there and use it? And building those communities, you can actually drive things you've never thought of. There's a whole thing around the Medici effect. I don't know if it's something you're familiar with, which is, if you put people from different backgrounds and different use cases into places, you can find use cases that are cross segmentation, cross different parts of the domain, that can really be interesting. And it stops us as an industry doing what we've always done. And I think, I say technology is not a silver bullet, but actually it's a really nice way we can move things forward quickly. We can put some forward thought into it, and we can break the rules, break the barriers a little bit, just to prove how we can do things differently. Because let's be honest, we work in an industry that probably for 200 years didn't evolve that much. The greatest invention was the ATM. And then if you look at the shift we've made from then, and sort of forced by the 2008 collapse into having to think differently, and we're not all making the ridiculous amounts of money, getting the bonuses and everything we drove before in banking. And so actually having technology drive change as opposed to be a way we implement change, I think is a huge shift in the model.
Yeah, no, I agree. But pre 2008, IT was very much just about cost and maintaining, and I think attitudes have shifted a bit. I want to go into a little bit about, and I agree with you very, very much that banks are more similar than different. I have throughout my career, I have a very sort of interesting helicopter view of global banks, and there are a lot of similarities in how they act. But when you've seen sort of an organization decide to pursue an open API strategy, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see happen?
Open API, closed mind, I think is probably a fun one to look at. It is a shift into thinking differently. It's an understanding of what is the art of the possible. So I think people get into open APIs because they realize the opportunity, but actually from an implementation cycle, they still implement them as if they were closed APIs. They still have that thought. They don't do what I just said around actually using the technology as a lens for innovation. it sort of reverses the stack. And I think if people still think that way, and this is where a lot of the challenger banks actually went very right. They looked at it from a technology lens and what can we do differently? How do we give a better customer experience? How do we satisfy things differently? And I honestly, one of my favorite things in this industry and being involved in banking is we went from the big players having disruptors in the the neobanks, or whatever we want to call them, the challengers, and then the bigger banks actually challenged back and disrupted the neobanks and said, we're keeping the share of wallet, we're keeping those daily banking options. And now we're in a beautiful hybrid model where you sort of got everybody's coming from different angles, but I think everybody is aiming towards this piece where they are trying to give best customer experience, make sure they have the agility in their business. People realize that a business model that we're going to plan 5 years out and build that transformation. No, nobody ever talks about the fantastic fact that none of those 5-year transformations ever gave a positive return on investment. Back to your earlier point about simplicity, all they did was add complexity. They added cost. It was very difficult to measure because guess what? The world moved on in 5 years and we were in the middle of another one. And so I think it's about having that change of not saying, hey, we're going to put technology in that's going to get us here in 5 years. It's about looking at it and saying, here is what we can do with this whole open API. It's what we call composable at Mambu. It's how do we build that ecosystem and drive something that building banking for an unknown future. How do we make sure that we win? How do we make sure that we build this collective ecosystem, this co-culture, co-innovation? Not doing that is the mistake they will make, and still sticking, which I think is very few now, but still sticking to the large scale 5-year transformation when actually it's much more sensible to do multiple renovations. That's where I think the biggest mistakes get made from a technology and business perspective.
It's almost like digital transformation is not a project; it's a lifestyle, ongoing lifestyle.
I love that. It's a way of life. We should get T-shirts. I like that.
Yes, you'll send me £5.50 for my trademark. So I wanted to go a little bit. I mean, you mentioned earlier about the need for a robust ecosystem and collaboration and a good documentation. So I wanted to go into some of those sort of detailed issues. In terms of sort of onboarding issues when using open APIs, what are some of the issues that you see happen at that time?
A lot of it comes from the same problems, and I think I think there are two problems I see. One is really down to poor documentation. So you'll get problems with not really understanding what return values are. It can take a lot longer to onboard, integrate, and move with the APIs as you expect to drive forward because there's a lack of documentation that doesn't give you a clear understanding. That's also linked with them not having a strong developer community, which means that you can be left on your own, and that's not a way to go fast. The other problem with the onboarding is generally around the legacy integration. Now, if you're completely greenfield, that's great. You don't have to worry about it. But that's not the case for most people. And so I think it can be very easy to read API documentation and look how you actually drive this and say, okay, well, with this call, we'll go to this piece and we will return that. Okay, fine. But when you start looking at process latency that gets built in and the assumptions from old legacy systems, you can end with some very runaway processes that have all sorts of crazy returns that are almost impossible to debug and find, because you'll be running things out of sync, and it's very, very difficult to see that unless you actually go through a step process. And when you step process, you're not running real time, and so there can be all sorts of strange things happen. For me, that's the key. It's that fundamental of the integration to making sure we have the calls to the legacy processes right, and we sometimes need to slow down the API calls and make sure that we have the delay for the legacy to catch up. A lot of people miss that. But it is that fundamental of having the basics of a good API. I mean, it sounds crazy that you would launch an API without the solid documentation, without an interest from a user group and making those things happen. But it happens. Everybody starts somewhere, and sometimes things can scale and get carried away too quickly. And if the API allows you to put in a ridiculous amount of calls, there can be breaking points. Even in modern platforms, you can see that not everything's running at the same pace. So those integration points are absolutely critical.
Mhm. I realize a lot of my questions directed at you focus on, what are the problems, what are the issues. So I wanted to sort of turn the next question on its head a bit. You talked a bit about, having proper documentation, but I want to look at, what do you consider a well-designed developer portal? What are all the elements that it needs?
API.mambu.com would be my first point of call for you. It, it has to be, as an ex-developer, it has to be intuitive. There has to be something where I can go and feel I have to support two levels of users. So a good developer portal needs to take the first visitor on a journey, give them clear documentation, clear ways of working, clear understanding of what are the calls they need to make, what are they expecting to return from it, and how can they then see how that integrates and do some very simple things. It also then needs to scale to the power users and somebody who's using this on a regular basis, to go and really make the differences when they don't need to wait and slowly key things in, follow a drag and drop way of working. There has to be multiple options and opportunities and ways to do this. Now, I use this as an example. I think if you look at I'm going to show my age now. If you look at a Mac, I've got a MacBook in front of me. If I want to use this the way most people use it, I can go and drag and drop the icons. I can click on things. I can move them around. Unfortunately, being an ex-Unix developer, I do a lot of things by going into the Unix prompts and programming in Vi, which is something that most people don't use anymore. But actually, I find that more interesting because I can do some more power-based things in the background of it. For me, that's interesting, and it's a good way of working for me because it's got a lot of things that I would take me hours just to move things around with the mouse and click on them. I think that's the sort of level you got to look at when you come into any sort of developer platform. There has to be that simple, hold your hand, here's how it works. But honestly, if somebody's been in the job for quite a long time, they'll know very quickly how to pick up. As soon as they can see the syntax that's pretty straightforward, they can see the expected return codes, know how error handling works, and see some very clear. I mean, one thing that I think is great, and again, I'll come back to our API documentation. Actually having some code segments in there that you can read and you can look at is something that gets missed often in a lot of these API tools and a lot of platforms. I think a lot of the developer SDKs don't really show you the code. They'll give you the syntax, but it needs to show you exactly what does good look like. What is actually happening here? How can you feel it? How can you drive through it? And then it's everything else around, I say the good documentation, the good way of working, but the developer community behind it, to have that network, which is why having a mature model and a mature system and mature platform has huge benefits, because that's how it's not just about driving innovation into what you're building or what you're giving your customers. You can actually drive innovation into the tool set, into the platform, and into the developer community. And that is how these things really thrive.
It's almost like the opposite between what you do for a customer. I think as a driver, I just want the car to start and the brakes to work. But as a mechanic, you want to open up the hood and see how everything works. So for a good developer portal, you need to show the developers everything that's under the hood and how it works for it to be. Yeah, no, that's interesting.
That was far more articulate than my example of going back to a 1980s green screen editing. So thank you.
No worries at all. I'm very good at the metaphors. So we're getting. I want to talk about sandboxes a little bit. I mean, I know sandboxes are kind of for testing and experimentation. What do organizations kind of expect from sandboxes, and are they being used correctly, do you think?
That's a good question. I think there are two types of sandbox users. There's the sandbox users where you want to drive the innovation, as you just said. You want to do the experimentation, the art of the possible. I think the two mistakes that get made there is it's a sandbox for one child sometimes, and they don't invite all their friends in to play and throw sand and make sandcastles together. That's where I think this community thing comes together. And you've got to open up a sandbox and say, hey guys, this is what we're doing. We're trying to achieve this. Let's bring it in. Almost the hackathon as a BAU would be a really nice way to look at that. And the other thing that gets in the way, unfortunately, is procurement processes, especially in some older banks, will still see this as and not just procurement, security, risk, and everything else. Will see this as we need to have the same sort of tolerances, the same controls, the same release cycles as we have in a live environment. That doesn't work, and that really does choke things very quickly. I think the other side of it is to actually prove out that something works. So, hey, this platform is interesting. We want to run it in a pseudo sandbox, can almost put it into a friends and family integration piece as an API that pulls back into your core systems. There's different levels of risk depending on how regulated you are, what geography you're in, and how you want to work. But I've actually seen in a couple of cases people actually building products on the fly and releasing them from a sandbox into a, I'm going to call them pseudo live, because you basically control the flow of who's actually using this new process, and you're keeping a very close eye on it. But it's a really nice way of introducing new innovation and doing real time, what we used to call operational acceptance testing, and you can really run those through the user base and show that this is working. That's a really cool thing to do. It really allows you to then move things quickly to market, especially in an environment where you've got regulators changing regulations overnight, or you've got a central bank suddenly putting liquidity constraints on something overnight, because we're seeing a lot of that in the market, more than we ever have before. Nice to be able to run that in something that's pretty much semi-real time, and then releasing it and rolling it out across the rest of the user base.
Interesting. I'm gonna have an image of a poor lonely child playing by themselves in a sandbox now at the end of this. So we need to invite more friends in. I get that. So we're getting to the end of our conversation. So I wanted to ask a little bit about where we're going. I often talk to the likes of like Starling and Monzo, and one of the things they often say is, well, we were digital from the start. We don't have these problems that an HSBC or an RBS or a Barclays might have. Do tools exist, or will they exist, that are going to help some of these legacy organizations transform into a digital environment now, or is that digital from the start always going to win out? What do you think?
It's a yes and no answer. So the digital from the start, I think, is a lovely pure way of doing it, and it makes complete sense. So Starling, Monzo, what everybody else is running, so N26, you want to push these guys through. They have definitely a head start, and I think it's interesting. The first generation of challenger banks sort of didn't do it the right way, and I think people have learned from that, because what happened was they opened up something that was very pure and legacy free, and then within 12 months were just a legacy. They just built a lot of processes the way it always been built, and automatically became into that problem. So I have a lot of respect for the way the real digital challengers have done it. And as I said, I think now the old school are becoming very wise to it. You can see a lot of spin-offs. I'm sitting in Amsterdam, we have New 10 at ABN AMRO. You've seen people like RBS have spin-offs. You've seen people like Santander. A lot of the big guys have these sort of speedboat ways of working. I think there have been a few things in the market where we've seen some of those not necessarily work on a business level, because there's been some sort of moving people across to a challenger brand against your own. You sort of almost have a bastardization of business, and there's all sorts of challenges that come with that. But I think there's a lot of technology lessons learned, and I think that as that's got learned, they can now build purely digital in-house in the bank and migrate legacy books of work, legacy loan books, legacy cores across. I think that is the answer. I think building on top of legacy is interesting, just based on one point for me, which is rip and replace. It's probably the oldest ironic adage in the industry, because nobody ever ripped anything. They replaced it, and then they left it underneath the 10% of complex deals or complex customers that were almost impossible because the guy who wrote that had retired 20 years ago. That has to get away from, and we have to take different decisions. But for me, digital first, and building digital is massively important. I think if you look in the dictionary around legacy, one of the definitions is software or hardware that's been superseded but is difficult to replace. I think we need to look and focus on the superseded and not on the difficult to replace, because the difficult to replace is fixable. The superseded means you're stuck. And for me, that is a fundamental of why we have to go to a purely digital rather than the hybrid model.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess I think we could talk about this for a lot longer, but we're running out of time. But Elliot, thank you so much for kicking off our toolkit section. Stay on FTT Digital Builder main stage for more panels and discussion. And if you go to the right-hand side of your screen, you can ask questions and give comments and interact with delegates and the speakers hopefully as well. Elliot, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.